Hi, this is John Loftus, and you're watching Atheist Edge.
All right. Well, hello, Internet. Nice to see you again. I am Chris from Atheist Edge, one of several hosts, and I'm joined today by Daniel Ray, who you may remember from past episodes of the show. He is a co-host on the Good Heavens podcast. And he also is the co-editor of a new book called The Story of the Cosmos, How the Heavens Declare the Glory of God. We just happened to have talked about it quite a bit last night at our monthly Atheist Christian Book Club meeting, which was a lot of fun. And we also had Alan Hainline there, who's the author of one of the chapters of the book. So, Dan, for our viewers who may not have be familiar with your podcast or your work, why don't you tell us a little bit about the book and what your goal was in putting it together?
Yes, thank you for having me, Chris. So the book was as a result of a event I had put together with Dr. Paul Gould at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary called Astrophysics and Fantasy, Hubble Meets Narnia. We brought together a C.S. Lewis scholar and a Hubble astrophysicist and brought them together for one evening for a presentation. Dr. Michael Ward talked about C.S. Lewis and Narnia and Lewis's love of cosmology. And we brought together with a Hubble Space Telescope scientist who was a believer. And so we talked about how the heavens declare the glory of God, how literature and fantasy and imagination and good science go together. And so out of that presentation, back in March of 2018, Paul suggested that we do a book. And so the story of the cosmos is a result of that event. And it is what we hope to think is a blending, a rich mix of good science, imagination, meaning, purpose, and how a small handful of professional Christians and scholars see the glory of God in the heavens in the 21st century. So it's not just a science book. There's good science in there, but there's also theological reflections and philosophy, history, literature, and imagination. So it's a really rich compendium of different facets of the universe. We have everything from meteorites to the imagination of J.R.R. Tolkien. Mm-hmm. So it's really cool. We think it's a pretty unique thing.
Yeah, I imagine when you're trying to break into come up with an entry into the robust Christian book industry, it's helpful to find a niche that may be not as well explored as maybe certain other topics. And it seems like you really found it here, and you found a lot of people willing to participate in your journey there. You got William Lane Craig in there.
Yeah.
You have everyone there from C.S. Lewis scholars to someone who works in the Vatican. So there's a wide variety of perspectives in there.
And, yeah, Catholic and Protestant too. So that was really neat. And the funny thing is, Chris, is that and during my research, there are Christian books on the universe, but you have to go looking for them, and you have to kind of know the authors, and they're not widely known. I mean, like I could add, you're pretty well read, and you guys cover a lot of Christian apologetic things. I mean, name a prominent author from the church who talks about the universe.
And I'll tell you what, I used to work in a Christian bookstore back in the day, and we definitely did not have a astronomy cosmology section. I don't even know where we would have filed that away. But
right,
yeah,
you know what I mean. I mean, aside from Bill Craig, who is speaking for the universe on behalf of the church in an intelligent and engaging way? I mean, I'm not saying that there aren't Christians that are doing that. There are, but it just seems like a scarcity of a well-rounded Christian voice in 21st century cosmology and astronomy.
Yeah, one thing that I found a parallel between kind of your work and also the book I read about Francis Collins is that you're both kind of working in fields that I don't want to put this on all Christianity, but because that's a broad group, but there is a definite vocal group of Christians who is skeptical of science and not prone to accept its conclusions, whereas people like yourself and Alan and William Lane Craig and Francis Collins have actually found that there is a compatibility there and a way that religion and science can speak to each other.
As I say very colloquially, there's an art to science and a science to art, and we need to make sure that line of communication is always open. That doesn't mean, for me personally, that doesn't mean that I know everything about science. As you saw last night, obviously, even among Christians, even between Alan and I, we can have a variation. In fact, some of our authors do. We have a variation of different viewpoints on the universe. We didn't sign a pact in blood that says we're only going to talk about the universe this way, and you can't be on our book unless you agree with us on these topics. Mm-hmm. No, here each author has its own voice in the chapters. We didn't force anybody. The only sort of requirement was, how do you see the heavens and how do you see the glory of God in the heavens? We didn't ask for theological criteria. We didn't ask for, we got together some people that we knew were conversant in the subject. My mind, I hold my science, my very limited knowledge of science, with an open hand. And I love reading about it, but I'm certainly not as knowledgeable as somebody like Alan or Luke. But that's the beauty of our book, is that we have different approaches. Rather than saying, oh, he's smarter than me, or they're smarter than me, we're just different kinds of knowledge brought together on the subject. And so I'm kind of the lay voice in the book. Whereas, of course, you have Luke and Alan and Bill Craig being more professional and scholarly. But that was what Harvest House liked. We had lay people, we had professional people, and it was just a nice mix.
Yeah, it seems like you got a little bit of something for everyone in there.
Yeah,
Even reading it as a non-believer, like, okay, we'll probably talk a little bit about where I had disagreements with some of the stuff in the book.
Sure.
But, I definitely learned just the sheer or the raw astronomy data. I learned a lot about binary stars and black holes and stuff that I didn't know before. So even just on that, I found that much more an interesting read than some of the other books.
Yeah, and so part of our audience, Chris, was, and as you know, and as I said last night, for me as the editor, one of my goals was, all right, let's communicate this to skeptics and say, here, okay, whether you agree with us or not, that's another topic, but at least we're going to dispel the notion that Christians don't think about this stuff. Mm-hmm. Whether you agree with their conclusions or not, of course, is a different thing. But here is, Dr. Bradstreet's been involved with binary stars for like 3 or 4 decades. Brother Guy's been studying meteorites as long as he can remember. We have Sarah, who's studied black holes and the physics behind black holes most of her career. So here's Christians who have an intelligent thing to say about it. And so that's at least one thing. And I'm glad to hear that you feel like you could still walk away from learning something from this, even if you don't have to agree with everything. And so that's great. I'm glad to hear it. We wanted to encourage the church and inform skeptics who might have a bad thing or two to say about, or to dispel the atheistic sort of meme mentality that Christians don't think about science.
For sure. So kind of going along with that line of conversation, one of the things that came up a few times in the book, and I've heard also on your podcast also, is the idea that the scientific community is loath to consider God as a option. There's the pure naturalistic thinking that precludes such things, and you and the authors in the book are of the mind that there's a way to integrate the two, and that one can inform the other. So I was kind of curious to get your view as to, okay, what would the end goal be? Like, if you are able to convince the scientific community that God should be factored into research and things of that nature, how would the scientific process change if that was the case?
Well, on page 11, to be very specific and limited to what we have in the book here, so I don't speak outside of my domain. First of all, I think all of us in the book acknowledge that we are not, at least we tried not to be overly generalistic about atheism or atheists, but that we addressed very specific, like Alan and Luke addressed Richard Dawkins specifically, without saying that all atheists think this way. And I think for the most part, in talking to Sarah and other people about this since we did the research, I think there's a large swath of scientists in any field who just don't care. It's not a big deal. They just come to work, they crunch numbers and go home, and they don't think about God, and they're not trying to eliminate God from anything. They're not, using their science against God. There's probably a majority of scientists who view this way. We address popular level astronomy, cosmology, spokespersons of science, which are largely, in part, agnostic, atheistic. You and I could think of a handful of them. Bill Nye, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Sean Carroll, and Lawrence Krauss, and Richard Dawkins to some extent. We're not saying that these people represent atheism per se and all atheists, but we are sort of just addressing the popular level arguments that are put forth in a lot of these works in relation to God. So in answer to your question directly, I have several quotes from our Hubble Space Telescope astronomer, Dr. Anton Kokomor, on page 10 and 11. These are public. You can get these online as well. So he describes how he sees Christianity and his faith, his Christian faith, and scientific endeavors. Specifically on page 11, because Dr. Kokomor is a Christian. He would be, he's been with Hubble for, 20 years, maybe. So he knows kind of what he's talking about. And he says on page 11, it's quite possible to contemplate the grand scale of the universe as revealed by modern astronomical science from the perspective of faith, where God is viewed as its creator, as revealed by Scripture, and that science and faith can fully be reconciled in this context. Science can be said to describe the physical mechanisms and processes of the universe, while the Christian faith considers God as the agent responsible for its creation and discuss the purpose of our own lives in that context, which is not really a question that can even be posed in a scientific setting. So, as we saw last night, James played the Pale Blue Dot, and Carl Sagan reading his contemplating thoughts about the universe, the pale blue dot picture. And there was a great deal of philosophical, meaningful contemplation in Sagan's words that were not entirely scientific. And so I think that last night, just Sagan's words alone and cosmos in general, point to the fact that there is a way between the worlds to where there is philosophy and theology and meaning and purpose that do come about from the things that science gives us, because the pale blue dot picture was given to us by a very technical space satellite, Voyager 1, and that image was taken in 1990. And so the scientific revelations cause us further reflection as human beings to address the questions of purpose and meaning. So they kind of go together. What is the endeavor of secular science? Why do we study the planets? Why do we send satellites out there? And what is the purpose of the Christian faith to declare the glory of God? So Dr. Kokomor sees the two as kind of going hand in hand. You can understand the mechanics of the universe and then, believe that God, as its creator, and still do good science, as he has done. He is well respected in his field and has written many peer-reviewed papers. So you can bring glory to God by doing a good job of it. And so the science and faith kind of go hand in hand and I think it requires, Chris, a sort of a creative intellect, a creative way of seeing things. That's what Sagan was so gifted at doing. He could see so creatively. He could see both sides of it and existed very comfortably in both the creative, scientific, science fiction. He wrote Contact. So he was very comfortable in both worlds of the imaginative and the rational, the scientific and the fantasy. And he loved them both. He loved myth. And so there's that sense that both can be combined. And so it's always, for me, to understand the universe better, I think it would be more helpful for science if it acknowledged who God was, because maybe you could make more progress in understanding. If we know what God is like, then we kind of know what the creation would be like as well.
So kind of, if I understand correctly enough to summarize, the day-to-day science, the actual process, the scientific method is not going to change.
No.
It's the interpretation of the data is how we factor that into our worldview.
That's a great way of saying it. Science is a methodology, not an ideology. And I think when you use science to try to say, well, science disproves God, what you're just saying, you're basically saying in a very colloquial way, method disproves God, but it's just a tool. It's just a method. But I think you've said it very well, that it being just a method, it's not finally incompatible with the Christian faith. You're going about examining the things, but it is the interpretation of the data where things, of course, differ in your worldviews.
So I think we're largely aligned on that. Even if I don't agree that maybe necessarily God is in the philosophical portion of that, or at least keeping the realms in their proper place. I think where it gets interesting for us non-believers looking into this is when God becomes let's see, what's a good way to put it? When God becomes the answer to a scientific question, that's where we start getting into accusations of God the gap start getting thrown around. And to kind of use an example from the book, in the fine-tuning chapter, Alan tries to use this analogy where he talks about Harry Potter, and there's an explanation in the book for why Harry went and did a thing, and then there is a kind of meta-narrative reason why J.K. Rowling, the author of the book itself, had Harry do this thing. So there's an in-universe explanation and a kind of out-of-universe explanation for what's going on. And I think where lines get crossed as we're looking at this is when the out-of-universe explanation becomes the in-universe explanation. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I don't think that I don't think Luke and Alan or anybody that is in the book would argue that God replaces quarks, or God replaces how the electrons and protons and neutrons behave. But I understand the point, because I think at a popular level, people can think that way. But for me, I believe. So last night we're offering examples, our own reasons for why we believe things, and I may believe in God or as an explanation for something for very simplistic reasons. I may say, well, the proton and neutron and electron coming together to form an atom looks like it was designed. Therefore, I infer designer. Therefore, I believe by faith that designer is Christ Jesus. It may be an unsatisfying or very limited explanation or reason for believing. It may be philosophically inadequate for a lot of people, but it's sufficient. But just my epistemic reason for belief doesn't necessarily impinge upon the actual truth of that belief. I'm just expressing my own particular rationale and reasoning for why I believe. But I think you're right in the one sense that we should not use God to replace, the idea of nuclear fusion. Well, how does the sun do it? Well, God does it. Well, what about the nuclear fusion? Well, we have to take both hand in hand, and I think that the mature thinking Christian would consider that, the proton chain in stars or any number of the constants or quantities of the universe, they go hand in hand. These are the works of God, but God doesn't, God doesn't replace the gravitational constant. We don't say, well, God just did it. Or, the perfect example is dark matter, dark energy. We don't know what it is. Science doesn't know what it is exactly. So God. But if you find a dark matter particle or dark matter energy thing, what does that do to God? And so that's the problem. And I think you have a point there, that we shouldn't just, put God in for where we can't explain things. Because when we can sort of explain things mechanistically, well, what does that do to God? As I said last night, the coffee and the barista, you can explain coffee by a coffee maker. And the mechanics of a coffee maker, you can also explain it by the fact that your parents made you coffee, or your friend made you coffee, or your spouse made you coffee. And both are legitimate, but they don't cancel out each other. So I would agree with you there that you don't want to say, well, mom did it, and ignore the mechanics of the coffee maker. I think they go hand in hand, for me.
Okay. Let's talk about another topic that I think we hit on very late in the discussion last night after we'd already been talking for 3 hours about it. And that was the idea that the orderly universe points to God. And this was, I believe, the second chapter, the Melissa King Travis chapter, where she kind of goes into the history of philosophy and talks about Johannes Kepler and how his work and his view kind of set up a system where the orderly universe can be used as evidence for a creator God. And I think part of my concern when reading the chapter is that I don't know what couple things. One, I don't know what a non-orderly universe would look like. We don't have any examples of it. I'm not sure if we have any reason to think that this universe was supposed to be disorderly and is only not disorderly by the hand of God. And the question of why human rationality is able to comprehend it. My my viewpoint, that would be kind of trivial to explain under an evolutionary paradigm, where a mind that was where a person whose mind is not capable of understanding the universe or what's going on around it probably isn't going to live very long, because it will not understand things like gravity or germ theory, or why or what that animal with fangs is doing over there. What might they be up to? So I don't know if you can kind of elucidate where to your view, the rationality of the universe is a direct consequence of God, and we shouldn't expect it to be seen without God in play.
Well, I think there are a lot of obvious unknowns for us as human beings when it comes to contemplating the universe we do know. I have no problem saying a lot of times I don't know a lot about the universe, not just being a layperson. On a larger scale, we've only ever been 240,000 miles away from Earth to the moon. So we have, in terms of human exploration of the cosmos, a very limited perspective on the universe. But the perspective that we do, I mean, this was Albert Einstein's hair-raising conundrum. Of course, I don't claim him as a theist or even a deist necessarily. When he said God, he wasn't talking about Yahweh. Einstein's God was more like the Greek logos prior to Jesus, just an organizing principle of the universe. But Einstein found it phenomenal that the universe, and it may have been Melissa or it may have been Sarah's chapter, where they quote him exactly. I don't know what page it would be on, but his whole thing was, it's amazing to him that the universe was even intelligible, that we could read it to such degree. If I may just screen share for a moment, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So just as an example about intelligibility that blows me away. Now, I can't explain what I'm about to show you in any great detail. I have no full capacity. Alan would be better at explaining what I'm about to show you than I would be, but I will. Can you see now?
Yes.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So, and as I understand it, this is the speed of light, 299,792,458 meters per second. That's the speed of light, or 186,202 miles per hour. That is the gravitational constant, which is a very weak number, a very small number. This is I believe that's either the Hubble constant or the energy density. I think that's the energy density of the universe. That's the cosmological constant. That's the energy density of the universe, if I'm not mistaken. This is the mass of the electron, 0.511 mega electron volts. And this is the mass of the neutron, 939.6 mega electron volts. And this is the mass of the proton, 938.3 mega electron volts. And so the head-scratching wonder of it all, Chris, is number one, Melissa raises the question of where do these numbers come from? Why are they so constant? Why don't they change? Why do they represent such rationality? And how did we figure them out? How did we find them? And how could we even measure them? How could we get mega electron volts? How can we see these things with such precision? I mean, if you change these numbers to a 939.6 or a 939, or you make the mass of the electron 1 mega electron volts, and there's no chemistry, there's no carbon, there's nothing. And so it is a profound, for me as a Christian, a profound fingerprint of rationality and intelligibility. If the universe was not rational, we would not even be able to see numbers like this. So I think the mystery, and of course you can say, oh, you're just God of the Gapsing it, but I would say as a Christian that I go from this to what it says in Hebrews 11:3, by faith we understand that the worlds were prepared by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things which were visible. So yeah, I'm probably one of those Christians that really quickly will go to, these numbers don't take you directly to Jesus. You have to make the inference, you have to act in faith that these numbers are, in fact, because an Islamic scholar could say that these point to Allah. But you have to take that step of trust and faith. It's an act of trust and faith and belief that God is the reason for these numbers. Otherwise, the numbers are just products of our own sentience, and we made the numbers up, but how weird that the numbers that we fabricated for ourselves fit so neatly into the universe. So I think it is, as Melissa says, we have an intelligibility and a rationality within ourselves that is able to identify and understand an intelligibility and rationality within the universe. And so, yeah, I mean, it's not definitive, conclusive, irrefutable proof that God exists, but there is a deep intelligibility, I think are Melissa's words, that it profoundly affects people when they see it, including Albert Einstein. It's a wonder that you have this kind of legibility in the universe. So that would be, Dan's response. In a nutshell, I'm sure there are more people that could articulate it better and more philosophically nuanced than I could. But the fact that the universe is intelligible and we can recognize it as such, and it goes back to our central verse in Psalms, that the heavens declare the glory of God, day to day pours forth speech, and night unto night reveals knowledge. And so that I think, if anything, modern physics and science affirms the ancient text of Psalm 19 that, I think you said it earlier, data, which means something given. It's the Latin datum. It just means simply something giving. And, data pours forth from the heavens night after night, day after day. That's why we build telescopes and satellites.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's, I'm hesitant to talk about fine-tuning too much, since we talked about it for about 2 hours last night.
I'm okay.
I'm okay with it. But this may speak to that there may be a cosmological answer to this that I'm just not in the loop on. But I don't know. A big part of Alan's chapter was saying that if these values were different, then this wouldn't happen. Or I believe he even used the phrase "menu of possible universes" as a comparison. And it seems like a lot of the case for fine-tuning is putting forth these hypothetical alternate universes where things didn't work out as well as they did in our universe. And I get that argument, and it certainly has sway. Jim on our channel, that's one of his big Achilles heels as far as what he will consider as arguments for apologetics. He certainly finds that found also. But I'm not sure what it's one thing to have these hypotheticals where, okay, there's all sorts of other ways things could have happened, but I'm not sure how that specifically speaks to this particular universe. I'm not as much of I like science, but much more of a history person. Okay. And I have a soft spot for alternate histories, like what if Hitler won World War II, or what if the South had won the Civil War? And it's fun to think about, and it's kind of interesting to try and trace the dots and see what would be different. But that doesn't necessarily have any bearing on what actually happened in reality. And I kind of view fine-tuning the same way, where unless there's a reason to think that the numbers could have been different, then we're just talking about, we're having fun mental exercises, don't actually bear on reality, if that makes sense.
Well, I think just briefly talking to Luke a couple of months ago and hearing him speak in different ways, I read Fortunate Universe and stuff. One of the things that struck me about what Luke does is, in order to sort of recreate a universe where he runs these scenarios, you kind of picture the cosmologist sitting down with a blank sheet of paper and doing pencil paper calculations and trying to say, well, if I adjusted the electron, what would that do for everything else? It's not quite that easy. They actually run these things through supercomputers. And so they change parameters. They literally go through, Luke does, he goes through and he spent his career tweaking the values of the cosmological constants and quantities. So they plug in, they load down software. That's how computers run. They plug in the software. They run a universe through supercomputers, so that the calculations, they take a long time to do because there's so much input to run, and they run it to see what the outcomes are. But the initial thing here is that the recreations or the simulations themselves require sentient, intelligent input, and not only in software, but of course computers, and not just computers, but supercomputers. And so there's a great deal of human intellect and intelligence that goes into just constructing a model of the universe. And so they build the model. Of course, it's not complete because it's not finally a universe. We can't test the universe. But computer models with an adjusted mass of the atom, or a computer model with an adjusted gravitational constant, or an adjusted energy density of the universe just by a little bit. And you don't have what we have in our universe according to these models. So it seems like, from the best kind of theoretical model building that we do, that you don't get a universe like ours when you play with the dials just ever so slightly. Of course, it's theoretical, because we can't test the universe, thankfully, right? We're going to play with the universe today. Dial if you think.
People seem to be doing their best, at least to mess with this planet. But.
Yeah, right. No, I mean it's kind of fun. I agree, and you're right. They're alternate histories. What if we do this? What if we do that? But and with history, you can't really do it. With the numbers, you can kind of do a little bit more with the history of the universe than you could with tweaking Hitler. You might try to program a person's thoughts into a computer and see which way it would have gone. You can be an author and creatively come up with, well, if Hitler didn't invade Poland, what would have happened? But with the universe, you can say, well, if an atom was a little heavier, what would we get? And theoretically come through, run a schematic where the universe turns into hydrogen soup or something. So putting the best minds on it, it seems as though, with our best theoretical models, and like Luke's colleague, Geraint, Lewis, who's agnostic atheist, I think, they are in 100% agreement with the numbers, and in 100% agreement with what happens when you tweak these numbers. What they don't agree with are the implications of these numbers, the origins, or where they came from. So it's not like the numbers are controversial among physics communities. They're all widely accepted, maybe with the value of the Hubble constant, which seems to constantly change the rate of expansion of the universe. These numbers are solid, and there's no disagreement on them. The controversy comes in what are the implications of these numbers for us. And I think that's what it boils down to. So yeah, I agree. You're only going to get theoretical constructs, but that's what secular cosmology does, builds theoretical constructs. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not condemning that exercise at all. That's what good science does. They try to build models in accordance with what we observe. But like I said last night, and talking to Sarah too, there's a lot of theoretical cosmology that's getting away from observational astronomy. And so there's kind of this in-house distinction between observational science and theoretical science. And the two seem to be going far apart nowadays. So there are others, it's not just Luke building models, there are other cosmologists that are building models. But in the secular models, Chris, like I said last night, it's always interesting to see how their postulations for what may be beyond our universe, or what may have caused our universe, oftentimes sound like theological. You and I talked about this. It often sounds like theological or monotheistic sort of explanations for what we have in the universe. So that's kind of my take on it. Yeah, we can't do anything but build models when it comes to the universe. And I think the striking implications that everyone agrees upon is, where do these numbers come from? The numbers are here, but the disagreement and the controversy and the philosophy, the theology starts to come in when we start to talk about where these numbers came from.
Yeah, and yeah, kind of circling back to what we were talking about earlier, it could be a difference in worldview.
Yeah,
as
absolutely.
far as what we do with the data. But do you think? I want to be careful I'm not putting words in your mouth.
No.
I assume you don't think this is an area that we need to stop investigating because God is the answer.
Oh, goodness, no. We're spending billions of dollars for satellite technology, and I think that God as an answer does not stop science. What I think stops science is I don't know who brought it up last night, but somebody said at some point, if there's no God, then there's got to be brute facts about the universe to some other degree. So in other words, the numbers I just showed you, I think some people take those as just brute fact, right? That's it. That's just the way it is. You're not going to get an explanation for why these things have this mass. And some people just want to brute fact that and go no further with it. Now, I think that stops science. To me, I'd be like, where these numbers come from? I want to find out. And I think there's a lot of people hard at work trying to figure out where those numbers came from. But if you brute fact something, if you just say, well, that's just the way it is, that's a science stopper. But I don't think that God is a science stopper at all. I think God invites us and built the fabric of the cosmos so that we are continuously investigating it. And I'm all for that. I'm all for it. You could explain everything mechanically in the universe. You can come up with M theory, the ultimate theory of everything. You can explain everything mechanically as best you can. So Luke Barnes does this. He's given this talk several years ago. He calls it Alberta's blackboard. And Alberta is the great, 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 great granddaughter of Albert Einstein. And she has finally come up with a theory of everything. And it's like a 1-inch equation or whatever. And she presents it to a compendium of physicists. And the bottom line is they see Alberta's equation on the blackboard. And nobody in that room is going to go, oh, okay, we can stop science now. What are they going to do? They're going to keep going. Where'd that come from? Where'd that come from? Where'd that come from? I think that's the nature of good science and good theology, is a continual exploration of our physical world.
Yeah, and to be fair, I remember the person who brought up the brute fact idea last night, and to my knowledge, and obviously the scientific community has not elected me to speak for them. If they did, then
that's okay.
If they did, they're not as smart as they think they are. But I imagine the scientific idea would be okay, we have these numbers, let's keep investigating them and see if we can figure out where they came from.
I think that's a good, healthy science. I agree.
And the only the problem from either side would be, let's stop investigating because they're brute facts, or let's stop investigating because God is the source of the numbers.
Yeah, no, I know that you don't do this, and I've not heard anybody, and no atheist that I've ever talked to actually says this. I've seen it in internet memes and stuff, but I really, and honestly, in talking to all skeptics who are knowledgeable about science in any degree, I have never actually had somebody tell me personally that God is a science stopper. I've heard that in popular social media, but I've not actually really, I don't think there is any thoughtful atheist that really thinks that when a Christian says God, that it really means to stop science, because as our book says, we believe in God, but we're still doing science. And so, no, I think we can amen, high five, fist bump on that. Yeah, good science, whether you believe in God or not, is a continual investigation of the physical world, as long as we have our abilities and faculties to do it. Yes.